Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tiesenghausen. June 9th, here are the main news stories at this moment. No sooner had the Russians patched up the bridge over Chongar to Crimea than the armed forces of Ukraine struck it again. Traffic across it is closed, and it feels like it will be for a long time. This was stated by the traitor and scoundrel Saldo. Well, it should be understood here that this bridge is definitely done for, and Ukraine has the means to simply destroy it completely. This is the second strike on the bridge in 2 days. This is already a death sentence. And let me remind you, last time the bridge was attacked by Ukrainian drones. Behemoths capable of carrying a 75-kilogram warhead and flying up to 300 kilometers. And today, the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Magyar, shared some very interesting information. It turns out that since June 7th, by order of the commander of the Russian military group Vostok, the use of the R280 highway on the Mariupol-Berdyansk-Melitopol-Simferopol section has been prohibited for transporting military cargo. In other words, the Russians have effectively closed off entry to Crimea for military cargo themselves. I think they'll close it for civilians as well. This road was the main land corridor for supplying Crimea and Russian troops in the occupied territories. So the occupiers have officially admitted that they can no longer guarantee safety on this route. As a result, freight traffic on this route hasn't just decreased, it is dropping and will soon fall to zero. Take a look at these statistics. The total traffic on this route to Crimea used to be 11,000 vehicles per day. Of those, freight transport accounted for about 3,800 vehicles per day. So at the beginning of June, the total flow dropped to 6,000. And freight transport to 1,000 vehicles per day. I think it's still falling, continuing to drop every day. In other words, the volume of freight shipments to Crimea via this land corridor, which Putin was so proud of, has dropped by 70%. So how then can the Russian group in the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions be supplied? Of course, this isn't a complete blockade of Crimea yet, nor a total severing of the land corridor, but it is a very serious deterioration of logistics for Russian troops. So now, for Putin, Crimea has become that very same sacred suitcase, without a handle. Obviously, he can't just throw it away, but carrying it is becoming harder and harder. That comment about Putin's sacred suitcase sounded a bit ambiguous, but all right. In the Krasnodar region, disruptions have begun at gas stations. Gasoline is starting to disappear. Local social media groups report that gas stations are closing, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to get fuel. Later, by the way, this information was confirmed by Governor Kondratyev himself, but here it's important to understand how he confirmed it. According to him, do you know who's to blame for the fuel shortage? That's right, Russians themselves are to blame because they started stockpiling fuel, and that's it. It disappeared. Not the burning oil refineries, not the burning oil depots, which Russians can literally see from their windows. No, absolutely not. It's the Russians themselves who decided to stock up on a can or two of gasoline or diesel. Well, look, there's already no gasoline in Crimea. People from Crimea are coming as gasoline pilgrims to Krasnodar Krai with those canisters. Residents of Krasnodar Krai see this, that there's already no gasoline in Crimea, and people are coming with empty canisters. Pilgrims have set off across the bridge to Taman. They think, wait, could this happen to us too? Well, of course it could. Of course. It's truly remarkable how the Russian authorities are able to hide and hush up problems. Even when gasoline completely disappears from all the gas stations in southern Russia, they still won't admit that it's a problem on their side. They'll say it's just that Russians bought it all up, took it all. In fact, Putin started his career by covering up problems. Remember how they tried to hide the story about the Kursk submarine? It sank for 4 days. Putin was riding around on a quad bike in Sochi, not saying anything about the fact that suddenly some problem had happened with the Kursk submarine. Well, maybe it would just go away on its own. As we can see, it didn't just go away. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. You can do it right now. It's important for the channel's growth. We're fighting against Putin's propaganda, so let's do it together. Let there be more people on the bright side, so make sure to subscribe. And not just that. Oil refineries, oil depots. The armed forces of Ukraine attacked the Protasovo airfield. That's near Ryazan, where there is a center for drone production and UAV operator training. On the territory of the airfield is the Ryazan Scientific and Production Center Protos, a site for the development, production, and testing of drones. That is according to Russian channels, and they also love to show on their regional TV, to show, here is where we do this, and here is where we conduct training, and here we do testing. So they showed it, thank you very much, and our drones flew right there. I'll show you the video now, and I got the impression that the people commenting off screen there, at first they thought it was one of their own drones. But take a look at this video. Isn't it beautiful? Just like that, bam, and right where it needed to go. Besides manufacturing, they were also training pilots there, including students. So later they'll start wailing that the poor innocent kids weren't to blame for anything. So these same so-called poor innocent kids are assembling drones in Alabuga, which then fly to Ukraine and kill civilians. So everyone is doing this knowingly and understands exactly what they're assembling. Listen, what came to my mind, after these routes to Crimea are being blocked now, these fuel trucks are burning, I imagine that this road to Crimea is now a road of death. There's no other way to call it anymore, where these Russian fuel trucks and military vehicles are being blown up. It's straight out of the movie Mad Max. Don't you get the same feeling of similarity? Remember, there was a city there, one with gasoline and another city with ammunition. They would periodically run convoys back and forth, and it seems to me that the Russians are doing exactly the same thing now. Before sending a fuel convoy through the Azov region toward Crimea, these crazed Russians are painting themselves with silver paint. So they spray this stuff on their faces and head off down the road of death, until our drones, turn them into mincemeat. And so Solovyov came out with some strange things, some kind of statements. Honestly, I think he's completely lost his mind. On his show, Solovyov revealed the secret of why Ukraine still hasn't been captured. Do you know why? Because nobody wants to carry out Putin's order. Can you imagine? Nobody wants to follow it. Putin's order. It turns out it's the Russian military who don't want to carry out Putin's orders. They don't report to him. Apparently, all you have to do is carry out Putin's order and cut Ukraine off from the sea. Just go ahead and cut it off. According to Solovyov, it's the simplest thing in the world. Take a look.
Вот там какой-то Бен Ходжес рассуждает о том, как блестяще действует Украина, пытаясь изолировать Крым. Вам сказать, что надо делать, чтобы не было изоляции Крыма? Надо выполнить указание Верховного Главнокомандующего, отрезать Украину от моря. Поэтому всего лишь вопрос к нашим уважаемым военным. Скажите, что вам для этого надо? Сколько людей? Сколько вооружений и какого? И все.
See, it turns out everything is as simple as can be. Putin just needs to be told how many occupiers there are, what kind of weapons. Putin will give the order, and that's it. Then they'll just cut Ukraine off from the sea. How come no one thought of this before? Maybe Solovyov doesn't realize that the occupiers are already fleeing from the Kinburn Spit. So now it's Ukraine that's about to cut Russia off from the sea. And by the way, where is the Black Sea Fleet? Solovyov, why isn't the Black Sea Fleet involved in cutting Ukraine off from the sea? The Black Sea Fleet isn't participating. Where is it? Why don't you tell us? Solovyov has really started to slack off, of course. That scumbag is just phoning it in. Before he at least tried to weave some kind of believable propaganda. But now it's just about capturing Odessa. Why haven't they captured it? Dnipro is supposed to capture it, cut Ukraine off from the sea. Well, go ahead and try. Go ahead, come over and try it yourself. Meanwhile, today in Balashika, near Moscow, another important occupier was blown up. A car was blown up there, with some very high-ranking Russian military officer inside. They say this officer held the rank of lieutenant general. Well, and the explosion in Balashika happened literally 300 meters from the spot where back in April another one was blown up. An important Russian occupier, deputy chief of the General Staff Yaroslav Moskalik, who at that time successfully went to a concert, you know whose. In general, the homes of these high-ranking Russian military officers are clustered together there, so someone important was eliminated. We'll find out soon enough who it was today. And in every episode, we have an important fundraiser for the defense forces of Ukraine. Today we are wrapping up the fundraiser for the first separate medical battalion. There's just a tiny bit left, so today we'll definitely close it out. The fundraiser is for ventilators, which are currently in very short supply at the front for advanced surgical teams. Take a look at this video with our wonderful medics, which they recorded for you.
Апарат штучної вентиляції легень – це не просто медичне обладнання, це шанс на порятунок та життя для пацієнта. В умовах бойових дій, де потік поранених часто є раптовим і непередбачуваним, таких апаратів потрібно дуже багато. До того ж, вони мають властивість ламатися та виходити з ладу від високого навантаження. Разом із каналом Бориса Тізенгаузена ми вже зібрали на 4 таких апарати, але цього все ще недостатньо для передових хірургічних груп нашого підрозділу. Тому ми оголошуємо збір ще на 2 апарати. Ми щиро дякуємо Борису та його глядачам за допомогу, небайдужість і увагу до питань порятунку українських захисників.
Let's help our combat medics. In this case, your donation means saving the lives of our defenders. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There are options for Mono, Privat, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. And of course, there's a QR code. If you're watching on another channel, it also leads to the fundraiser. In every episode, a special thank you from me and from the hundreds of our soldiers whom you have already helped. Thank you so much. Together we are a great force. Remember that. One more piece of news. Putin tried so hard at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum to say that the Russian economy is about to rise from its knees, is flying somewhere into space, and is now going to show everyone what it can do. But the market didn't believe it. The market didn't believe it. Let me quote. Absolute disappointment. The Russian stock market crashed to a 6-month low after Putin's main economic forum. Somehow even the Russian market didn't believe Putin and kept falling. Strange, isn't it? Why didn't they believe him? It seemed like Putin was being pretty convincing. I think that even the people sitting in the hall don't believe Putin anymore. He's sitting there, grinding his dentures, spouting some nonsense about burning coal, and no one believes him anymore. Everyone's just sitting there thinking, God, when are you finally going to die? Well, not everyone, but definitely some of them. And here's another interesting piece of news. The road to Putin's residence in Valdai has been covered with anti-drone nets. Anti-drone nets have appeared on the M10 highway in the Valdai district. They were installed above truck parking lots. And that's about 10 kilometers from Putin's residence. This is what they look like. It's scary, of course, scary for the underground hill. Well, I think this is after Operation Web, when drones took off from trucks and struck Russian planes. So they decided to stretch nets over the areas where the trucks are parked. But what stops someone from launching drones from a truck while it's moving, instead of at the parking lot, for example? I think that soon, not only the roads and forests around Putin's residence, but everything will be covered with a net, like a giant web. And at the center of this web, in the residence, will sit the nasally voiced, Botox-filled spider. But you know, as history shows, something can come flying in from where you least expect it. One of his associates might just whack him right on his bald head with something heavy at the most unexpected moment. And that's it. Another important, albeit belated, but important piece of news. The European Union will ban entry to all participants in the war in Ukraine from the Russian Federation. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has presented the 21st package of anti-war sanctions. But you know, it's strange that this wasn't done in the first year of the full-scale invasion. But it seems to me that other categories of Russians have been very undeservedly overlooked here. For example, FSB employees, prosecutors, tax officials, Russian officials of all ranks, all members of the United Russia Party, and communists. In their case, I think it would be much easier to form a short list of those allowed, and that's it. Here's another interesting point. In the previous episode, I mentioned that after the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the head of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, disappeared somewhere. She didn't even attend this significant forum. There were also several other events where she was supposed to participate afterwards. She wasn't there either. Something is going on. Maybe she really doesn't want to embarrass herself. Against the backdrop of this kind of news, it turns out that the central bank has recorded the largest cash outflow from banks in 30 years. Let me repeat, the largest in 30 years. In other words, Russians have started withdrawing money from banks. Well, that means they're sensing something. You see, the market didn't believe Putin, and Russians didn't believe Putin either. At least some people still believe. And now, look at this interesting initiative. Russian schoolchildren will be involved in collecting the memories of participants in the so-called special military operation and frontline volunteers. This initiative was put forward by Russian officials. So what are these Russian officials actually saying? For example, Mikhail Myakov, the scientific director of the Russian Military Historical Society, says that children themselves ask about the war, so stories about soldiers won't be traumatic for them. They will involve kids in collecting these kinds of stories. Remember those stories, like someone carrying 8 people on their back or taking out 15 tanks with a single shot? This is what school children will be collecting. School children themselves ask about the war and want to collect this kind of nonsense. Well, please, of course we believe that. And let me just remind you that the Russian Military Historical Society, which is obsessed with this nonsense, is headed by Medinsky, that very same Putin court lackey and chief rewriter of history. Another piece of news: the head of the State Duma Committee on Labor has urged people not to give in to hysteria over reports of layoffs this year. A massive wave of layoffs is coming. It's the largest wave in the past 6 years. But the chairman of the State Duma Committee on Labor, Yaroslav Nilov, said the following: he's practically a rival to Peskov. There's no need to panic about this, but you shouldn't relax either. That's just brilliant. Honestly, it's amazing. Putin says that unemployment in Russia is at its lowest level in almost the entire history. And there are hundreds of comments from Russians in different regions saying that there are record layoffs happening. So who's talking nonsense in this case? Who's just babbling, Putin or the Russian people? I had a video on TikTok about this topic, and people from all over Russia actually showed up with specific examples, naming which factories, which enterprises. They wrote that there is simply an unprecedented wave of layoffs, and not only layoffs, by the way, but also delays in salary payments. Maybe that's why the head of the central bank, Nabulina, has disappeared. She sees where everything is heading and probably just doesn't want to be blamed later for, say, freezing Russians' deposits or confiscating those deposits. And one more piece of news at the end of the program. So the so-called Starlink killer, in Russia they wanted to launch a Starlink killer. They launched 16 satellites. Well, the satellite of the Russian Starlink analog broke down and burned up in the atmosphere. It happens. The failure befell the Razvet project, which was supposed to provide broadband internet access. That's how it gradually comes to an end. One satellite entered the dense layers of the atmosphere and burned up over the North Atlantic. The rest, 15 of them, are still wandering around in orbit, but even among those, about half are barely limping along. The Razvet project, let me remind you, is that very same Starlink killer of Elon Musk. The Russians promised to catch up with and surpass Elon Musk. Let me remind you that Musk has a constellation of 10,000 satellites in orbit, while the Russians have 15 satellites. There used to be 16, but now there are 15 left. Putin was promised that they would surpass Elon Musk, but they just need another 400 billion rubles allocated, and then by 2030 the Russians will launch 300 satellites. By that time, I think Elon Musk will have about 50,000 satellites in orbit. Meanwhile, the Russians want 300. Although I think that by then there won't even be a Russian Federation anymore, and there will just be a single lonely satellite flying through the blackness of space with the robot Fyodor on board. And as for you, my friends, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Subscribe to this channel, don't forget. Let's help our combat medics. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. Have a peaceful day, everyone, and glory to Ukraine.